So the motivation for this project was from a change in policy and a need to understand better how individuals can be involved in providing and in supporting sustainable public services. And we wanted to understand how volunteering participation varied both across individual characteristics, household characteristics, but also across local characteristics or geographic characteristics varied in space as well as between individuals. The motivation of Acumen in giving support to this project is to make use of existing data. The Scottish Household Survey data is collected. There's potential there for further analysis, and this was some analysis that hadn't been done before to this depth, but also to promote the use of quantitative methods by researchers both in academia, in policy, and in the third sector as well. To show what can be done with this sort of data, to make suggestions about how other organizations may want to do further analysis of themselves. So I'll touch on that a little bit as well. And essentially what we're wanting to understand is we've got some descriptive analysis from the Scottish Household Survey, which is published by the Scottish Government and is available. And that gives some sense of how characteristics affect the likelihood of volunteering. But what we're wanting to look at is how these characteristics jointly affect the probability of volunteering, and then also how local area characteristics, which aren't in the Scottish Household Survey, have an effect. So this project is working together, myself at Stirling University and with Helen here at Volunteer Development Scotland. And what we're doing here, which is slightly different, is that as well as analysing the Scottish Household Survey data, we've also matched in local area data from the Scottish neighbourhood statistics, which are drawn from the census and from other surveys, so that we have some characteristics of the very local area in which the individuals are working. Or are living, sorry. Now, obviously, because of anonymity and confidentiality, we don't know within the SHS data exactly where individuals are, but we have data on local area, and then the Scottish Government were able to help us by matching in the local area characteristics so that we're able to observe the characteristics of where somebody's living without knowing exactly where that is, so that we have really fine detailed local data. So the Scottish Government did that matching for us, and that's matching local area characteristics at the data zone level. So you may be aware that for statistical purposes, Scotland's been carved up into data zones. They're really small areas that are designed to contain about the same number of people. They have around 600 people in the data zone, although it varies a bit. And the people within that data zone should be broadly similar in a number of characteristics. And so we're able to get data about housing, education, income deprivation, accessibility, labour market for that very local area, and have those characteristics matched to individuals in the Scottish Household Survey. So to start then, we want to think about what our sort of theoretical structure is, about what makes people decide to volunteer, to supply their volunteering. And there are obviously going to be benefits and costs to volunteering. So we can think about some of the benefits that could be gained from volunteering, the satisfaction of helping others, the enjoyment of the task itself, the increase in skills, experience and knowledge from the activity, and perhaps an increase in social capital as well through meeting and working with other people. Of course, there are also costs to volunteering. First of all is the opportunity cost, the fact that you could be doing something else instead. Now you might think about that as being, well, you could be in paid employment and earning a wage, so that might be a measure of opportunity cost, but other commitments on your time, such as having family, care for children, hobbies and other activities, are also alternative activities that form part of the opportunity cost. So there's a cost there in deciding to volunteer as opposed to deciding to do something else. And then there could also be some costs in the act of volunteering as well, including your travel, your expenses to get there, and there'll be some cost in finding a suitable opportunity as well. In being able to match to an opportunity that suits you and suits what you're offering. So we mentioned some capitals here, human capital, social capital, as well as there being potential benefits from volunteering in these capitals. They could also have an impact on how easy it is for you to volunteer. Whether you're able to access the networks in order to find out about volunteering opportunities could be dependent on your on your experience, on your education, and on your social capital and your connections with others. So some of these factors could both be benefits and also things that contribute to the costs of volunteering as well. Volunteering in the, well, first of all, I'll say a little bit about the Scottish Household Survey. So it's a survey of households in Scotland. It's conducted so that it's representative over a two-year period. It samples 31,000 households. The volunteering question is asked of half the sample. So there's a volunteering question asked of one random adult within about 15,000 households every 2 years. And we've then put together data from 2006 to 2009 where a random adult has been asked questions about volunteering together into a data set. The question in the Scottish Household Survey is quite a good volunteering question in that it asks a question about volunteering in 2 stages. So one of the issues in asking about volunteering and in how you word the question is about how people define volunteering, whether when you're asking people whether they volunteer or not, whether they share the definition that you have of volunteering and whether they're engaging activities that you might consider to be volunteering, but they don't use that label for. So the question in the Scottish Household Survey says that they're going to ask about the kind of things that some people do to give up their time without pay to help people or for the benefit of their neighbourhood or a wider area, either through organisations or acting as individuals. Thinking back over the last 12 months, have you given up any time to help any clubs, charities, campaigns or organisations, I mean in an unpaid capacity? So it doesn't actually use the word volunteer, it's asking about giving your time unpaid. For people who say no to that, there's then a second stage follow-up question which says we often find that people forget about some of the things they've done because they only do them occasionally or wouldn't normally think of it as helping people or their community. Have you undertaken any work or activities on a voluntary basis for any of these types of groups or organisations at any time in the past 12 months? And there's then a list of types of organisations which might trigger someone to say, oh, actually, well, I do help that group. And so they'll then be coded as volunteering. So the combination of those 2 questions is what determines whether someone is noted as being a volunteer. People who are classed as volunteers are then asked a series of questions in more detail. One drawback is that we can see with the focus there on organisations, on clubs and societies, that really it's picking up formal volunteering. And wouldn't necessarily pick up informal volunteering that's not in that context. So we have to be aware in analysing this that it's really that formal volunteering that we're focusing on, and I think that's an issue that will come out in some of the talks and the rest of today. Okay, so here we have the participation rate for males and females who are volunteering across the time period. We can see that it's between about 25 to 32%. It's been relatively flat. There is an increase between 2006 and 2007, although this new question was introduced in 2006, and then the extra categories to remind people were expanded between 2006 and 2007, so that maybe caught a few more people that wouldn't have classed themselves as volunteers. It's been relatively stable, although it appears in the raw descriptives to be going down slightly, but it's pretty minor. And we see that female participation seems to be higher than males throughout the time. Okay. One of the things that I said we're interested in is how volunteering participation varies in space. And one aspect of this is looking at the differences in urban and rural participation. So here we've used the Scottish Government's 8-fold urban-rural classification. So that goes from large urban areas on the left here, and increasing in rurality and in remoteness through to very remote rural on the right-hand side there, and everything in between. And this raw descriptive here shows that there's a clear increasing in participation as rurality increases and accessibility decreases. So it is lowest in the large urban areas, around 25%, and in very remote rural, it's up above 45%. So that's a pretty dramatic urban-rural difference in volunteering participation. And obviously, we'd like to try and explain, to some extent, why this might be. These are just the raw descriptives, so it could be that the people who are in urban areas as opposed to very remote rural areas are different from each other in a number of characteristics, in age, in education, in income, or anything that might determine volunteering participation. So one thing we want to do is control for those differences in the populations, if you like, and see if that explains the urban-rural difference. The other thing that might have an impact are local area characteristics, our local labour markets, housing markets, transport networks, that aren't characteristics of the individual or their household, but of the place in which they live. So further then, we'd like to see whether they have an impact. And that's what we're doing in the analysis here. Okay. So in order to analyze this using the data, we have to have some way of modeling volunteering. Okay, now you can think about well, what we observe is an answer, a yes-no to this question, or at least a yes-no to two questions that's put together. So we just have an observation of 0 or 1. 0 if you don't volunteer and 1 if you do. What we can think about is a continuum of a propensity to volunteer. People are on different stages, and at some point above that critical point they decide to volunteer, and below that they don't. So it's not just that people are in two states, people can be along this continuum, but we're only going to observe people actually volunteering or not. We can then use this data to estimate the probability of volunteering, conditional on a range of individual characteristics, household characteristics, and local area characteristics. And now we've done this using a software package called Stata. You could also do it using other software packages such as SPSS, or you could also do a more basic version of the sort of analysis we've done here using Excel. So there are accessible ways to work with this data and to do something similar. So thinking a bit more about this propensity to volunteer, then we think about a continuum. People are along this continuum where you're less likely to volunteer on the left here and more likely to volunteer on the right. And this is at least theoretically measurable continuum, but it's not an observed continuum. We don't actually see people's propensity to volunteer, but they have one. It increases from left to right, and there'll be a critical point in the middle there, above which people volunteer, and we observe a 1, and below which people don't volunteer, and we observe a 0. And so what we're looking at is, given where you are on this continuum, what's the probability that you will be observed volunteering or not? Okay. So we look at 3 different questions in the data. The first one is participation. And this is just whether you volunteer or not. And I'm going to talk about some of the findings from this analysis. So this is looking at your probability of volunteering given your individual characteristics, the characteristics of your household, and the characteristics of your local area. So we can see that even once we control for demographic characteristics, women are still more likely to volunteer than men. There's not a lot of variation in age once we control for other characteristics, although you can see that in the descriptives. It's relatively low for those 25 to 39, and it does increase around retirement, but there's not as big a variation in participation by age as the raw descriptives might suggest. Education is a significant predictor. Those with more education are more likely to volunteer, and reported religion is also a significant predictor. Some of the household characteristics. Having children makes individuals twice as likely to volunteer as those without. Thinking about our opportunity cost, I mean, that might be a surprising result. We could think of 2 effects of children, that having families look after increases the opportunity cost of volunteering if it's time away from them, so that might make people less likely to volunteer. On the other hand, having children perhaps gives you more opportunities to volunteer with a school, with a nursery, or with sports clubs. So this seems to suggest that effect on the opportunity to volunteer is dominating the opportunity cost in the decision to volunteer. Income is positively correlated. Higher incomes are more likely to volunteer, and this is both through home ownership and also through household incomes. Those on their own are more likely to volunteer, so in couples are less likely. And once we control for these characteristics, so we can hold the demographics constant, income, education, age, etc., we can then look at a time effect. And in fact, what this suggests is that volunteering participation seems to have actually increased if you held the population constant. So if we had exactly the same population this year as we had 4 years ago, volunteering would actually be higher. So the drop in volunteering that we see in the descriptives is due to changes in the makeup of the population, not in a reduction of the inclination to volunteer. Okay. And then thinking about some of the geographic characteristics, as with the descriptives, we find that even once you control for differences in the individuals and households, we still find much higher participation in rural areas. So it's not explained by there being different people in rural areas from urban areas. And there's still this dramatic difference, and it also increases with remoteness, not just with rurality. So as I said, they have this match data which says, well, maybe, okay, there aren't differences in the individuals, but perhaps there are differences in the local areas, in housing and employment, etc. So we control for those characteristics, and although that has a small effect on explaining this urban-rural difference, the majority of it is still there. So it's not explained by differences in these characteristics either, and still remains. So some of the local area characteristics that have an effect, health levels in the area that you live and education levels in the area that you live increase the likelihood that you will volunteer, but employment and income deprivation don't, in the local area rather than yours, don't have an impact on your probability to volunteer. So one of the challenges in interpreting these and reporting them, I mean, I've given you some headlines there, is that because we're modeling this probability, the effects of the characteristics are non-linear. And what that means is that the effect of being male or female is different depending on your other characteristics. So the difference of being male and female is different whether you have high education or low education. So you can't just say that women volunteer more than men by this much, because it depends on the other factors. And so the impact of changing one characteristic depends on the levels of the other characteristics. So that makes reporting it and understanding it challenging. But one way to do that is to come up with some examples of people with given characteristics, and then look at the difference from changing one of those characteristics. So that's what I'm going to do here. Now, this isn't a representative sample. These are 4 case studies for made-up people with characteristics, where we'll hold everything else about them constant, and we'll change one thing, and you'll get some sense of the size of the effect. Okay. So first of all, these are our four people here, and you can see that they have quite different volunteering participation, ranging from the lowest, about 16–17% for Duncan on the right here, and Claire has up nearly 42–43%, and everything in between. So with different characteristics, individuals can have very different probabilities of volunteering, which obviously isn't captured in just a mean figure. So we'll take Alan first of all. So he's male, he's working, age 35 to 39, he's married with no children, he has a secondary school education, and what we're going to look at is the difference in his volunteering participation if he were in an urban area or a rural area. Now, one caution here is that our analysis isn't necessarily telling us about causality. We're not necessarily saying that if Alan moved from an urban area to a rural area, he would become more likely to volunteer. What we're saying is that 2 identical people, like Alan, one in an urban area and one in a rural area, the person in the rural area has a higher probability of volunteering. We're observing people with identical characteristics volunteering more in the rural areas. So this is to give you a sense of that comparison, but I'm not actually saying that if we moved everybody into rural areas, we would suddenly all have volunteering participation. Okay, so we have to be a little bit careful about the causality. Okay, so we can see when we observe Alan in an urban area, his volunteering participation is about the national average, just over 31%, but moving him to a rural area takes it up to about 45%. So there's an increase of about 12–13%, something like that for people with his characteristics between urban and rural areas. If we then look at Barbara, so she's female, she's slightly older, she's married, has children, and has a university degree, and we also look at an urban-rural move for her. This has both of them, Alan's in the orange and Barbara's in the yellow. We can see that she has overall a lower probability of volunteering given her characteristics, but still observes about the same increase in moving urban to rural. So there is a strong effect with even with different characteristics. So our third example then is Claire. So she's a bit older still, age 60 to 64. She's single. She's not working. Has a secondary school education, and what we're looking at is a change in her education. So someone with her characteristics who had O-level qualifications as compared to someone with her characteristics who is identical except they have HND level qualifications. So we can see that for her profile, her voluntary participation is well above average. Before the education is above 40%. And there's an increase of about 10% up to about 52% from that increase in education. So education is also having a significant effect. And our last example then is Duncan. So he's a bit younger, male, he's working, age 25 to 29, single, no children, has a university degree, and we want to look at a change in his income, as a change in his household income. Okay. So from a change in his household income of about £10,000, we can see him being younger and working has a lower volunteering participation than the average, about half the average, and just over 15%. But that an increase in household income of £10,000 does boost that by about 7%, something like that. So there is a positive effect of income. It's not as big as the urban-rural effect or as the education effect, but it's still there. Okay, so that maybe gives. Obviously, one can come up with as many different case studies and look at different combinations. But hopefully, that gives you a feel for how volunteering participation changes across people with different characteristics, and then also the effect of changing some of those characteristics. Okay, so the second question that we're going to look at very briefly is volunteering frequency. So this is a question asking how often do people volunteer? And the possible responses, these are categorical responses, so they vary from a few times a year, or less often than a few times a year, right up to several times a week. We can see there are, most people are volunteering fairly frequently, and there's another spike at a few times a year, but there's quite a variation. Okay, so frequency does increase with age. The older you are, the more often you're going to volunteer. Until about age 50, and then it increases till about 75 years. So there is another spike just prior to retirement and around retirement that only declines once people get much older. Having children also increases your volunteering frequency, so not just the probability you're going to volunteer, but also the frequency with which you volunteer. Being in employment makes you volunteer less frequently, but some of the other characteristics that affected participation aren't significant for frequency: income, education, and occupation. But again, we do see an effect of religion. And over time, there's a small impact in increasing frequency over the time period, but it's quite small. We really don't see any or very little geographic variation in frequency, so there's not an urban-rural difference in how often people are volunteering. And these local area characteristics have a small effect. Health, housing, and levels of income in your area do have a positive effect on your frequency, independent of the rurality. And the last volunteering question is the number of hours. So individuals are asked how many hours they volunteered in the previous month. So this gives you an idea. Of the mean values are between about 9 and 12. They're slightly higher for men than women, and they've been relatively stable over the period. Maybe for men there's a small increase, but it is quite small. Okay. Once we control for individual characteristics, we can see women volunteer just under 1.5 hours per month fewer than men. There's not a big effect of age until post-retirement. Again, that's when we see people spending more time volunteering. and income in itself isn't significant, but whether you're in the labour market or not is, if you're not working, then you are more likely to volunteer more hours. So that's not surprising. And this is where we see a negative effect of children. So having children dramatically reduces the number of hours spent volunteering. So that suggests that we have that's where the opportunity cost is coming in. People are more likely to volunteer if they have children, but they're doing fewer hours. And again, we're seeing a positive effect from religion and education. There's very little regional variation in hours. There's no urban-rural difference, again, like the frequency, and there's not really any effect of a local area characteristics. So the number of hours people are volunteering seem to be driven by their individual and household characteristics rather than the place where they live. Okay, so some brief discussion about some of these findings and starting to think about what they mean. We'll have some discussion here, but we're also looking forward to this afternoon, seeing what people have to say about them, how they think this could be applied, and what their interpretation of some of these findings are. So, I mean, we've seen that individual characteristics are important in affecting volunteering participation. Several of them have quite a big difference. Some household characteristics, particularly your relationship status and number of children and household income, are also important. But the characteristics of neighbourhoods also have a significant effect, and that's something which we maybe haven't thought enough about in the past in trying to explain why this difference exists. However, what is interesting is that all the difference seems to be in the participation decision. So we're seeing this urban-rural difference really in whether people are volunteering or not. So more people are volunteering in rural areas, but they're not volunteering more frequently or for a greater number of hours. So it's really driven by an impact on participation rather than on the intensity of individuals. If you look at two volunteers, urban and rural, they're not their level of involvement isn't differing greatly. It's just about the numbers of people that are doing it. Okay, which I've said there. Yeah, that's just saying what I've said. Okay, so our conclusions are then really that there are significant urban-rural differences which still exist after we control for the characteristics of individuals and of households. Still exist after we control for the characteristics of neighbourhoods in which people are living, and which is difficult to explain with the data that we have. So there are other things going on which would explain this, which we'll need to look at. Obviously, we're focusing here on the supply side. If you like, this is individuals' decision to volunteer, and this is suggesting that we need more work and a better understanding of the demand side for volunteering as well, and how that might differ in urban and rural areas. I hope that we've shown that this secondary analysis can be valuable, that we can get additional insight from further analysis of data that's been collected. I mean, all the money's been invested in collecting these data sets and collecting the Scottish Household Survey. The data's there on a range of topics, a lot of characteristics, and there are these questions about volunteering, and there are more volunteering questions which we haven't looked at here about the sort of activities people are doing and the sort of organizations. But I hope we've shown that there is potential in doing further analysis to help us answer some of these questions, and that there is opportunities to do some innovative things as well in linking in local data and being able to explain more even than is in the data set. And there would certainly be potential to link other data sets as well. If you're interested in looking at volunteering in a particular area and you have data about the characteristics in the local area that of your own or from your organization, there could be potential to link in and to look at the impact of that. So that's worth exploring. And there's certainly potential for doing further research using this data and taking what we've done further. Organisations can access the Scottish Household Survey data. It's available through the Economic and Social Data Service. If organisations that are registered charities can get access to that and be able to download the data and work with it yourself. As I'm saying, while to do some of the more complicated things, you would probably want some statistical software such as Stata or SPSS. You could do much of what we've done here using Excel, using other spreadsheets, spreadsheet software packages. So there is potential for some analysis to be done by organizations themselves to better understand these determinants of volunteering and how it might impact. This project obviously was funded by Acumen. I mean, they exist to promote the use of quantitative methods and of analyzing data that is out there. And they have a range of resources to support researchers with doing this sort of analysis. Training, they have training sessions, conferences, masterclasses, a support forum. So if you are thinking about doing something like that, it's worth getting in touch with them, looking at the resources that are available. There is help available to enable you to do some of these things. Okay, thank you.